At least 10 men who guarded Hitler's life were sentenced to 20 to 25 years in Soviet labor camps after Berlin fell. Most served roughly a decade in the Gulag, interrogated for years, forced into brutal labor, then quietly released in the mid-1950s. Political thaw. The bodyguards captured by American forces? Interrogated? Yes. Imprisoned for 2.5 years at most, then released. Same job, same proximity to the Führer. Completely different fate, decided entirely by which army reached them first on May 2, 1945. The line between a decade of Siberian labor and a brief detention in Bavaria came down to geography and timing, nothing more. Inside the concrete tomb beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's personal security was a small, intimate circle, names that interrogators would later pry from transcripts. Telephone operators like Rochus Misch, who routed the regime's final desperate calls. Chauffeurs like Erich Kempka, who knew every back road in Berlin. Adjutants like Otto Günsche, trusted with the most sensitive errands. And SS officers tasked with one job: keep the Führer breathing. When the bunker's lights began to flicker in late April 1945, these men were released from their oath of loyalty by Hitler himself. They scattered into a dying city, each one carrying secrets the victorious powers desperately wanted. The Red Army was closing in from the east, the Americans were pushing from the west, and the distance between those two armies, measured in mere miles, would soon decide who lived in freedom and who vanished into the Gulag. Some never made it out of Berlin alive. On the evening of April 28, 1945, SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's personal liaison to Hitler and the husband of Eva Braun's sister, was dragged into the Reich Chancellery garden. He had slipped away from the bunker days earlier, found drunk in civilian clothes at his Berlin apartment with a suitcase of cash and jewelry. To Hitler, this was unforgivable desertion at the moment of greatest need. Therefore, Fegelein was stripped of rank and shot above ground, 2 days before Hitler himself would put a pistol to his temple in the room directly below. 4 days later, on May 2nd, the breakout began. Groups of bunker survivors tried to slip through Soviet lines under cover of smoke and rubble. Peter Hügel, deputy commander of Hitler's close protection unit, was one of them. He had spent years standing within arm's reach of the dictator. But near the Weidendammer Bridge, gunfire tore through his group. Hügel was fatally wounded that same day and died in the ruins of central Berlin, never identified by a coroner, never properly buried. 2 men, one shot by his own side for trying to escape too early, the other shot by the enemy for trying to escape too late. Their deaths were quick by the standards of what was coming, because the men who survived May 2nd, who raised their hands instead of running, would soon discover that surrender to the Red Army was its own kind of slow execution. Rochus Misch, the telephone operator who heard that muffled gunshot from Hitler's study on April 30th, surrendered to Soviet soldiers in the U-Bahn tunnels. He wouldn't see Berlin again for 9 years. 9 years of interrogations at Lubyanka, transfers between labor camps, freezing nights. The same questions about the bunker's final days, asked by different officers in different rooms over and over. Otto Günsche, the towering adjutant who'd personally carried Hitler's body up those stairs and helped douse it in gasoline, got 25 years of hard labor in 1950. He served 11 before they sent him home in 1956. Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot, drew the same 25-year sentence. Released in 1955 after about 10 years. Johann Rattenhuber, commander of the entire bodyguard unit, was handed 25 years by a Soviet military tribunal in 1951. He walked out in 1956, only to die the following year. Captivity had broken him. Heinz Linge, the valet, spent roughly 5 of his 10 years under strict interrogation, repeating identical answers to different interrogators, confirming the same details again and again. The Soviet Ministry of State Security questioned at least 10 key members of Hitler's inner circle, cross-checking every account to prove, beyond any doubt, that the dictator was dead. 25 years on paper, 9 to 11 years in practice. Then Stalin died in 1953. The camp gates opened, quietly, no fanfare, no apology, just release. Compare that to what happened in the American zone. Julius Schaub, Hitler's chief personal adjutant for over 2 decades, the man who had burned the Führer's private papers at the Berghof in the final days, was arrested by U.S. forces in May 1945. He was interrogated thoroughly, held in internment, and then released in 1947, roughly 2.5 years. He returned to Munich, opened a small pharmacy, and lived quietly until his death in 1967. Erich Kempka, the chauffeur who had personally driven the jerry cans of gasoline to the garden above the bunker and helped set Hitler's corpse alight, was captured by American troops on June 20th, 1945. He talked. He gave detailed statements that became cornerstone evidence in Western accounts of Hitler's death. And in October 1947, he walked out a free man. 2.5 years, total. The pattern repeated across the Western zones. If specific war crimes could not be directly proven against a bodyguard, internment ended and civilian life resumed. The Americans wanted information, not a decade of labor extraction. Men who had stood the same watches, polished the same boots, and guarded the same hallways as their Soviet-captured colleagues were home before the Marshall Plan was even announced. The dividing line was not guilt. It was geography. A few hundred meters east or west on May 2, 1945, and a man's next decade was either spent in a Kazakh labor camp or behind the counter of a German shop. Rosas Mish walked out of Soviet captivity in 1954, returned to Berlin, and opened a paint shop. For 40 years, he sold wallpaper and interior decorating supplies to West Berliners who had no idea the quiet man mixing their colors had heard the gunshot that ended Adolf Hitler. Most never knew. He kept his head down, ran his business, lived his life. Then, in the 1980s, he started talking. Interviews, documentaries, eventually a memoir. By the time he died in 2013 at 96, he was the last man alive who had been in that bunker on April 30th, 1945. The others did the same. Gunsche wrote a book. Linga sat for historians. Bauer gave interviews into his 80s. Their testimonies became the foundation. Fest used them, Kershaw cited them. Joachim Stalin built timelines from their words. Every major Hitler biography published after 1970 rests on what these men remembered or said they remembered decades later. The Reich demanded loyalty until death. Geography decided who actually died. Fegelein, shot in the Chancellery Garden, April 28, 1945. Hugel, bled out during a breakout attempt May 2nd. Mish, 9 years in Soviet captivity, then 4 decades selling paint and wallpaper in Berlin, dying at 96. Gunsche, 11 years in a Gulag, then quiet retirement, signing autographs for historians until 2003. The men who stood closest to the most monitored human being of the 20th century scattered into the most uneven afterlives imaginable. Some were buried in rubble, never excavated. Others got quiet headstones in Munich cemeteries. A few gave interviews when their grandchildren were grown, forcing Germans to reckon with the fact that the man who heard Hitler's suicide shot was still alive, running a small shop, answering questions for documentary crews into the 2000s.